Something bizarre happened in Appalachia today. The media will not talk about it, and by the time you finish hearing this, you will understand exactly why. What if I told you that deep within the mountains of eastern Kentucky, there exists a community that has been deliberately erased from every modern record, every census, every map produced after 1987? What if I told you that the people who once lived there did not simply move away, but vanished under circumstances so disturbing that local authorities chose silence over investigation? This is not a story you were meant to hear. This is not a chapter of American history that anyone in power wants you to know. But the documents exist. The testimonies exist. The photographs, yellowed and cracked, still sit in a forgotten archive in a county courthouse that most people drive past without a second glance. What happened in Harrow Hollow between 1971 and 1986 represents one of the most chilling examples of institutional abandonment, human desperation, and collective psychological collapse ever recorded on American soil. The families who lived there were not criminals. They were not outcasts by choice. They were ordinary people, miners and farmers and mothers and children, who were systematically forgotten by a government that found it easier to pretend they did not exist than to address the slow-motion tragedy unfolding in those hills. By the end of this account, you will learn three things that were never meant to leave those mountains. First, you will understand the horrifying practice that emerged when a community was left without medicine, without law, without hope. Second, you will discover what the children of Harrow Hollow were forced to witness night after night in the winter of 1983. And third, you will learn why, to this day, there is a 17-mile stretch of road in Breathitt County that no local resident will drive after dark. Stay until the very end, because the final chapter contains the testimony that was sealed by court order for 35 years, a testimony so disturbing that the judge who heard it reportedly never spoke of the case again. This happened to people exactly like you, people who believed they were protected by the same laws and systems that you trust today. And by the time you understand what truly happened in Harrow Hollow, you will never look at those distant mountains the same way again. The history of Harrow Hollow begins not with tragedy, but with hope. In the early 1950s, the Consolidated Mineral Company of West Virginia expanded its operations into the remote eastern reaches of Kentucky, drawn by geological surveys that promised rich veins of coal beneath the ancient Appalachian ridges. The company needed workers, and workers needed homes, so in 1953, a small settlement was established in a narrow valley between two steep, forested mountains. The company called it Camp 14, but the families who moved there gave it a different name. They called it Harrow Hollow, after the old farming tool that breaks ground for new planting. It was a name full of optimism. These were people who believed they were building something. The first wave of settlers arrived in the spring of 1954. They were mostly young couples from the surrounding counties, people who had grown up in poverty and saw the mining company as a path toward stability. The company provided small wooden houses, a general store, a one-room schoolhouse, and a promise that as long as the coal kept coming, the paychecks would too. For nearly 2 decades, that promise held. The men descended into the earth each morning and emerged each evening covered in black dust, their lungs slowly filling with particles that would shorten their lives by decades. The women maintained the homes, raised the children, and built a community that, despite its isolation, functioned with a quiet dignity. There were church services on Sundays, held in the schoolhouse. There were seasonal celebrations. There were births and deaths and marriages, all recorded in a leather-bound book kept by the company clerk. By 1965, Harrow Hollow had a population of nearly 400 people. It was small, yes, and desperately remote, but it was alive. The children who grew up there would later describe it as a place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were never locked, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the shifts at the mine and the turning of the seasons. But beneath this surface of normalcy, there were already signs of what was to come. The coal veins were not as rich as the surveys had promised. Each year the miners had to dig deeper, travel farther into the mountain, work longer hours for the same pay. The company began cutting costs. First, they reduced the staff at the general store. Then they stopped maintaining the road that connected Harrow Hollow to the nearest town, a 40-mile journey that became increasingly treacherous each winter. By 1970, the writing was on the wall, but the families of Harrow Hollow had nowhere else to go. They had built their lives around the mine. Their skills were specific to that work. Their homes belonged to the company, and so they stayed, even as the world outside began to forget they existed. The collapse came faster than anyone expected. In February of 1971, the Consolidated Mineral Company declared bankruptcy. The announcement was made in a Charleston courtroom hundreds of miles away, and the families of Harrow Hollow learned of it only when the supply truck stopped coming. There was no formal notification, no severance pay, no assistance with relocation. One day, the company existed. The next day, it did not. And the people who had given their labor, their health, and their years to that company were simply abandoned. The immediate aftermath was characterized by confusion rather than panic. The families had some food stored. The men knew how to hunt. The women knew how to preserve. They assumed that someone would come, that the county or the state or someone in authority would recognize that nearly 400 American citizens had been left stranded in a remote valley with no income, no transportation, and no way to communicate with the outside world. They waited through February. They waited through March. No one came. The road out of Harrow Hollow had always been difficult, but that winter it became impassable. A series of storms had washed out 2 bridges and left the dirt. Track buried under mudslides. The few families who owned vehicles discovered that they could not leave, even if they wanted to. And so the isolation began, not as a dramatic event, but as a slow, creeping realization that they were truly alone. By April, the food situation had become serious. The general store had been stripped bare within weeks of the company's collapse. Hunting provided some relief, but 400 people cannot survive indefinitely on wild game, especially when the hunters have to range farther and farther from the hollow to find anything. The first signs of malnutrition appeared in the children: swollen bellies, thinning hair, a listlessness that the parents tried desperately to explain away. The community organized as best it could. A council was formed, made up of the older men who had natural authority. They rationed what remained. They assigned hunting parties. They tried to repair the road, but the damage was too extensive, and they lacked the equipment. One group of younger men attempted to walk out, to reach the nearest town on foot and bring back help. They left in early May. 2 of them returned 3 weeks later, exhausted and empty-handed. The others had turned back, or gotten lost, or simply given up. The 2 who made it to civilization reported that they had found help, that they had spoken to county officials, that supplies were coming. But the supplies never arrived. To this day, there is no record of that conversation in any county archive. It is as if it never happened. The summer of 1971 brought temporary relief. Gardens were planted. The hunting improved. The community adapted to its new reality with a resilience that would have been admirable under different circumstances. But the underlying crisis had not been resolved. There was no medicine, there were no doctors. The nearest hospital was a 3-day journey on foot, assuming the roads were passable, which they were not. The first death that summer was a child, a boy, named Thomas Whitley, 7 years old, who developed a fever that would have been easily treated with antibiotics. He died in his mother's arms, while his father watched helplessly, knowing that in any other part of America, his son would have survived. The second death was an old woman, Clara Hensley, who'd been managing her diabetes with insulin that ran out in June. She lasted longer than anyone expected, but by August she was gone. The third death was a mining accident. Even with the company gone, some of the men continued to work the mine, extracting coal that they hoped to trade if contact with the outside world was ever restored. A tunnel collapsed. 2 men were trapped. The community spent 3 days digging them out, but by the time they reached the bodies, there was nothing left to save. These deaths changed something in Harrow Hollow. The hope that had sustained them through the spring began to curdle into something darker. People stopped talking about when help would arrive. They started talking about what they would do if it never came. The church services continued, but the prayers grew more desperate. The council meetings grew more tense. Arguments broke out over food, over firewood, over perceived unfairness in the rationing system. The fabric of the community, woven so carefully over 2 decades, was beginning to fray. And then, in September, something happened that would set the stage for everything that followed. A stranger arrived in Harrow Hollow. He came on foot from the north, following an old game trail that most residents had forgotten existed. He was thin, dressed in clothes that had once been fine, but were now torn and filthy. He said his name was Elias Croft, and he said he had come to help. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because what you are about to hear in the next chapters is something that has been deliberately hidden from public knowledge for decades, and this is the only place where the full truth will be told. Elias Croft claimed to have been a doctor. He carried a leather bag that contained medical instruments, bottles of pills, and syringes that he said held precious medicines. The people of Harrow Hollow had no way to verify his credentials. They had no way to contact anyone who might confirm or deny his story, but they were desperate, and desperation makes people believe what they need to believe. Within days of his arrival, Croft had established himself as an essential figure in the community. He treated minor ailments with pills that seemed to work. He cleaned and bandaged wounds. He spoke with authority about infections, about nutrition, about the steps the community needed to take to survive the coming winter. The council welcomed him. The families trusted him. The children were told to call him Dr. Croft. But there were those who noticed things about Elias Croft that did not quite fit. He never spoke about where he had come from, or why he had been walking alone through the mountains. His medical bag contained instruments that seemed too new, too clean, too expensive for a country doctor wandering the wilderness. And sometimes late at night he was seen walking alone toward the abandoned mine entrance, carrying a lantern and that leather bag, returning hours later with mud on his boots and something that looked like satisfaction on his face. The first winter after the collapse was brutal. Temperatures dropped to levels that the oldest residents could not remember. The snow came early and stayed late. Hunting became nearly impossible. The stored food dwindled, and the deaths began to accelerate. By December, they were losing someone almost every week. The old, the very young, the already sick. There was nothing Croft could do to stop it, or so he said. His medicines were running low. His supplies were exhausted. The community would have to make difficult choices if it wanted to survive. It was Croft who first proposed what he called the gathering. He presented it to the council as a medical necessity. The community needed to concentrate its resources. The weakest members, he argued, were consuming food and fuel that could keep the stronger members alive. If everyone was to die, then everyone would die. But if sacrifices were made, some could be saved. The council resisted at first. These were their neighbors, their friends, their family members. The idea of choosing who would live and who would die was unthinkable. But Croft was patient, he was persuasive, and the bodies kept piling up in the frozen ground behind the church, where the soil was too hard to dig proper graves. By January of 1972, the gathering had begun. The exact nature of the gathering has been pieced together from testimonies given decades later, from fragments of journals that survived, and from the accounts of the few children who grew up to tell what they remembered. It was not, as some later sensationalized accounts would claim, a ritual of deliberate harm. It was something more insidious. It was a system of organized abandonment. When Croft determined that a member of the community was too weak to recover, too old to contribute, or too sick to justify the resources being spent on them, that person was moved to a separate building at the edge of the hollow. It had once been a storage shed for mining equipment. Under Croft's direction, it was converted into what he called the Quiet House. Inside the Quiet House, the chosen individuals received no food, no water, no medicine, and no heat. They were given blankets, nothing more. The door was locked from outside. A guard was posted, not to prevent escape, but to prevent anyone from bringing them supplies. The community was told that this was mercy. Croft explained that these people would die regardless, that the only question was whether their deaths would be prolonged and painful or quick and peaceful. By withholding resources, he argued, they were allowing nature to take its course. By concentrating those resources on the healthy, they were ensuring that the community would survive. Not everyone accepted this logic. There were protests. There were families who refused to surrender their sick. There were confrontations at council meetings that came close to violence. But Croft had supporters, people who had become convinced that survival required harsh measures, and those supporters enforced the system. By the end of that first winter, 17 people had been placed in the Quiet House. None of them emerged alive. The community buried them when the ground finally thawed in April, in a mass grave that was later covered with wildflowers so that anyone passing through would not see the disturbed earth. What the community did not know, what would not be discovered for another decade, was that Croft was keeping records, detailed records, notes on how long each person survived in the Quiet House, notes on the progression of their decline, notes on their final hours, observed through a small window that Croft had installed in the shed's door. These notes were not the work of a doctor trying to save his community. They were the work of something else entirely. The years that followed fell into a terrible rhythm. Each winter, the gathering would resume. Each spring, new graves would appear on the hillside. And each summer, the survivors would try to rebuild what had been lost, knowing that when the cold returned, the cycle would begin again. The outside world had not forgotten Harrow Hollow. It had simply decided that the hollow was not worth the trouble of remembering. County records show that in 1973, a survey team was dispatched to assess the condition of the road. They drove 20 miles, encountered a washed-out bridge, and turned back. Their report stated that the road was impassable and that repair would cost more than the county could afford. No mention was made of the 400 people who lived beyond that washed-out bridge. In 1975, a journalist from a Lexington newspaper heard rumors about the abandoned mining community and made inquiries. He was told by county officials that the settlement had been abandoned in 1971, that the residents had relocated, and that there was nothing to investigate. The journalist accepted this information and moved on to other stories. He never visited Harrow Hollow. He never spoke to anyone who had lived there. The people of the Hollow, meanwhile, had stopped expecting rescue. A generation of children was growing up with no memory of life before the collapse. They knew nothing of the world beyond the mountains. The Hollow was their entire universe, and the rules of that universe were set by Elias Croft. By the late 1970s, Croft had become the undisputed authority in the community. The original council had either died or been marginalized. New leaders, men who owed their positions to Croft's favor, made the decisions now. The gathering continued each winter, but it had become normalized. Families accepted it. Children were taught to accept it. Anyone who questioned it too loudly found themselves on the list for the next gathering. The quiet house was always waiting. If you are still watching, take a moment to consider this question and leave your answer in the comments below. If you had been born in Harrow Hollow, if this had been the only world you ever knew, would you have accepted what was happening, or would you have risked everything to resist? By 1983, the population of Harrow Hollow had fallen to just under 200. Half of the original community was gone. Some had died of natural causes. Some had perished in the quiet house. A few had attempted to escape over the mountains and were never seen again. Those who remained had adapted to their circumstances in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the hopeful families who had arrived 3 decades earlier. But among the children of the Hollow, something was changing. A generation that had known nothing but Croft's rule was beginning to ask questions that their parents had learned not to ask. They wanted to know what lay beyond the mountains. They wanted to know why no one ever came from outside. They wanted to know what was really happening in the quiet house, because by now the stories were circulating. Stories of sounds heard at night, stories of Croft's late-night visits, stories that did not match the official explanation of peaceful natural death. The leader of these questioning children was a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Whitley. She was the daughter of Thomas Whitley, the first child to die after the collapse, and she carried her father's memory like a burning coal in her chest. Her mother had died in the quiet house 3 years earlier, chosen by Croft during a winter when food was particularly scarce. Sarah had been told that her mother's death was merciful, that she was too sick to survive, that the community had no choice. Sarah did not believe it. In the summer of 1983, Sarah began keeping her own records. She noted who was chosen for the gathering and why. She noted how long they survived in the quiet house. She noted the patterns she saw, patterns that Croft probably never expected anyone to notice. What she discovered was that the selections were not random. They were not based purely on health or age or contribution to the community. There was another factor. The people chosen for the quiet house were disproportionately those who had questioned Croft's authority. They were the troublemakers, the skeptics, the people who asked uncomfortable questions or who had allies that might challenge the current power structure. The gathering was not just a survival mechanism, it was a tool of control. Sarah shared her findings with a small group of trusted friends, other teenagers who had begun to doubt the world they had been raised in. They called themselves the Watchers, and they made a decision that would change everything. They would document what was really happening in the quiet house. They would witness it with their own eyes. The winter of 1983 arrived early, and it arrived with a ferocity that even the oldest survivors struggled to comprehend. By late November, the snow was chest-deep in places. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in buckets left beside the fire. The gathering began in earnest, and this time, the list was longer than ever before. Croft announced that desperate times required desperate measures. 12 people were selected, including 2 children under the age of 10. The community accepted this with the grim resignation it had learned over 12 years of practice, but the Watchers did not accept it. Sarah and her group had spent the fall preparing. They had identified a spot in the forest behind the quiet house where they could observe without being seen. They had stockpiled blankets and firewood to survive the cold nights. They had agreed on a schedule of shifts so that someone would always be watching. And on the night of December 3rd, 1983, when the first of the chosen were locked inside the quiet house, the observation began. What the watchers witnessed over the following weeks was later described in testimony that a judge would seal for 35 years. The details are difficult to recount. The official transcripts use clinical language that obscures the human reality of what occurred, but the essence can be stated. Elias Croft was not simply allowing nature to take its course. He was actively studying the process. He was measuring, recording, comparing. The small window in the door of the quiet house was not for observation from inside, it was for observation from outside. Croft would spend hours watching through that window, making notes in a leather journal, timing events with a pocket watch. When the end came for each person inside, Croft was there, always, watching. The watchers documented everything. They had no cameras, no recording, equipment, nothing but their own eyes and a series of hand-drawn diagrams showing what they saw. They recorded the dates, the times, the duration of each session. They recorded the expressions on Croft's face, which they described uniformly as calm, focused, and eerily satisfied. By mid-January, Sarah had compiled enough evidence to present to the community, but she faced an impossible dilemma. Croft controlled the community. His supporters were everywhere. If she came forward openly, she and her friends would likely be added to the next gathering. She needed allies among the adults, people with enough standing to challenge Croft and survive. Sarah found her ally in an unexpected place. His name was William Marshall, and he was one of the oldest surviving original settlers. He had been a mine foreman before the collapse, a man respected for his fairness and his steady temperament. He had never challenged Croft openly, but neither had he supported him with enthusiasm. He was a survivor in the truest sense, a man who had learned to navigate impossible circumstances by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. But William Marshall had his own secrets. His wife, Ellen, had been taken to the quiet house in 1979. He had been told she died peacefully. He had accepted this outwardly, but a doubt had lingered. Ellen had been strong. She had been recovering from her illness. There had been no reason to choose her except that she had spoken against Croft at a council meeting the month before. When Sarah approached William with her evidence, he did not react the way she expected. He did not express shock or disbelief. He simply nodded, slowly, as if something he had long suspected was finally being confirmed. Then he said 4 words that would change the course of events. He said, "I know about the mine." What William knew, what he had kept secret for over a decade, was that the abandoned mine was not truly abandoned. Croft had been using it. The entrance that everyone believed was sealed had been reopened, and deep inside, in a chamber that had once stored explosives, Croft had created something that William had glimpsed only once, years ago, when he had followed Croft on one of his late-night walks. William did not know what he had seen in that chamber. The memory was fragmented, confused, suppressed by the natural instinct to reject what the mind cannot process. But he remembered enough. He remembered shelves. He remembered jars. He remembered the smell of something that should not exist in a place of rock and darkness. And he remembered turning away, walking back to the hollow, and never speaking of it again, until now. The plan that Sarah and William devised was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. They would enter the mine. They would document what Croft was hiding. And they would use that documentation to turn the community against him before the next gathering could begin. The timing was critical. The current winter was the worst in memory. If they failed, if Croft discovered what they were doing, they would not survive to see spring. But if they succeeded, if they could expose him completely, then perhaps the community would finally find the courage to act. William remembered enough of the mine's layout to guide them. Sarah recruited 4 of her most trusted watchers to accompany them. They waited for a night when Croft was occupied with other matters, when the guards would be at their most complacent, when the snow would cover their tracks. That night came on February 2nd, 1984. The temperature had risen slightly, enough that movement was possible. Croft had spent the evening in a meeting with his closest advisors, discussing the spring planting that would never happen the way they planned. The guard rotation left a window of 2 hours when the approach to the mine entrance would be unwatched. At midnight, the group assembled. 6 people, 1 lantern, no weapons. They moved through the snow-covered hollow like ghosts, their breath visible in the frozen air, their footsteps muffled by the powder that had fallen that afternoon. The mine entrance was exactly where William remembered it, hidden behind a screen of dead brush that had been arranged to look natural. They cleared the brush. The entrance gaped before them, a rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the light from their lantern. Sarah went first, then William, then the others, one by one, descending into the earth where generations of men had extracted coal and lost years of their lives to the black dust that filled their lungs. The main tunnel stretched before them, sloping downward, the walls glistening with moisture that had frozen into delicate ice crystals. Their footsteps echoed, their breathing was loud in the silence. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 20 minutes, following William's instructions, turning left at a collapsed side tunnel, then right at a junction marked with an old company sign that was now unreadable beneath layers of grime. And then they found it, the chamber that Croft had made his own. The door was new, metal, locked. But the lock was simple, a padlock that William broke with a rock from the tunnel floor. The door swung open, the lantern light spilled inside, and Sarah Whitley saw what Elias Croft had been doing in the darkness beneath Harrow Hollow for 13 years. The chamber was lined with shelves, floor to ceiling, extending back into the shadows beyond the reach of the lantern. On those shelves were jars, hundreds of jars, glass containers of various sizes, sealed with wax, labeled with dates and names that Sarah recognized. The names of the dead, the names of everyone who had been taken to the quiet house. Inside the jars were samples, tissue, fluid, things that should have been buried with their owners but had been removed, preserved, catalogued. And at the far end of the chamber, on a desk that must have been carried down piece by piece over many years, were the journals, leather-bound books, identical to the one the watchers had seen Croft carrying, dozens of them, filled with data, observations, measurements, comparisons. Elias Croft had been conducting experiments. The quiet house was his laboratory. The people of Harrow Hollow were his subjects. He was not studying how to help them survive. He was studying how they died. The details in those journals, later examined by medical professionals who struggled to maintain their composure, revealed a methodical investigation into the limits of human endurance. How long can a person survive without water, without food, without warmth? What are the stages of decline? How do age and prior health affect the timeline? What are the visible indicators that the end is approaching? Croft had been answering these questions, one death at a time, for 13 years. He had turned Harrow Hollow into a closed system, a perfect environment for his research, free from outside interference, free from oversight, free from anyone who might stop him. The escape from the mine was chaotic. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the journals she had grabbed as evidence. William had to be helped by 2 of the watchers. The shock of confirmed truth had weakened him in a way that physical hardship never had. They emerged into the night air, gasping, trembling, their minds struggling to process what they had seen. And they found that they were not alone. Elias Croft was waiting for them. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, wrapped in a heavy coat, his breath steaming in the cold air. Behind him stood a dozen of his most loyal supporters, men with clubs and shovels, men whose families had survived the winters precisely because they had chosen to follow rather than question. No one spoke. The lantern light flickered across the frozen ground, casting shadows that danced and twisted. Sarah clutched the journals to her chest. She could feel her heart pounding, feel the blood rushing in her ears. This was the moment. This was where everything would be decided. Croft broke the silence first. His voice was calm, almost gentle. He said that he was disappointed. He said that he had hoped Sarah, of all people, would understand. He said that what he had done was necessary, that the knowledge he had gathered would save lives someday, that the people who had died in the quiet house had contributed to something larger than themselves. He said that she could still be part of that. She could still survive. All she had to do was hand over the journals and accept the reality of what Harrow Hollow had become. Sarah looked at him, looked at the men behind him, looked at William, who was barely standing, looked at her friends, the Watchers, who had trusted her enough to follow her into the darkness. Then she ran, not away from Croft, toward the hollow, toward the houses where families slept, toward the center of the community where, even at this hour, the fire was kept burning through the winter night. She ran, screaming the truth that had been buried for 13 years, screaming the names she had seen on the jars, screaming about the chamber, the experiments, the journals she carried, the monster who had been living among them, wearing the mask of a healer. Croft's men pursued her, but the distance was too great, and Sarah was young, and fear gave her speed that desperation could not match. She reached the central fire just as the first doors began to open, just as the first confused faces emerged into the frozen night. And she told them everything. The response was not immediate. 13 years of conditioning cannot be undone in a moment. Some refused to believe her. Some accused her of lying to undermine the community's leadership. But enough believed. Enough had their own doubts, their own suspicions, their own losses that had never quite made sense. William arrived, supported by the Watchers, and confirmed what Sarah had said. Others who had seen fragments, who had wondered about Croft's nighttime visits, who had noticed patterns they had tried to ignore, added their voices. By dawn, the community was divided. Half supported Croft, half demanded answers. The tension that had been building for over a decade finally broke. What followed was not organized. It was not planned. It was the spontaneous release of years of suppressed grief, anger, and guilt. The people who believed Sarah turned against those who supported Croft. Families who had lost loved ones in the quiet house confronted families who had enforced the selections. The violence was brief but intense. When it was over, Croft was gone. He had slipped away during the chaos, disappearing into the mountains with a handful of his most devoted followers. His fate remained unknown for years. Some said he died in the wilderness. Others said he found his way to another isolated community where he began again under a different name. The truth was never established. What was established, finally, was contact with the outside world. In the aftermath of the uprising, a group of survivors made the journey out of the hollow on foot. They walked for 5 days through snow and forest, following half-remembered trails, until they reached a small town where people stared at them as if they were ghosts, which, in a sense, they were. The survivors told their story. At first, no one believed them. A community cut off for 13 years, hundreds of people abandoned by their government, a man conducting systematic studies on human decline. It sounded like fiction. It sounded impossible. But then the authorities went to Harrow Hollow, and they found the mine, and they found the chamber, and they found the jars. If you have watched until this point, you have heard what most people will never hear. This is the truth that was buried, the history that was erased, the testimony that was sealed for 35 years, because those who sealed it believed the world was not ready to know. The legal aftermath was complicated and ultimately unsatisfying. No one was ever charged with crimes related to the Quiet House. The reasoning, as explained in sealed court documents, was that the circumstances were so exceptional, the isolation so complete, that normal legal standards could not apply. How do you prosecute a community for decisions made under duress that no prosecutor, no judge, no jury could truly understand? Several of Croft's former supporters were questioned, but none faced trial. The deaths were classified as resulting from natural causes exacerbated by extreme conditions. The journals were placed in a restricted archive, accessible only to medical researchers with special clearance. What those researchers learned has never been publicly disclosed, but the fact that the research was deemed valuable enough to preserve tells its own disturbing story. The survivors of Harrow Hollow were resettled, given small financial assistance, and encouraged to rebuild their lives. Most struggled. How do you return to normal society after what they had experienced? How do you explain to new neighbors why you wake up screaming, why you cannot bring yourself to trust doctors, why the sight of a locked door fills you with unreasoning terror? Some succeeded, others did not. Sarah Whitley eventually became an advocate for isolated communities, working to ensure that no population would ever again be abandoned by the institutions meant to protect them. She testified before congressional committees. She wrote articles. She never stopped fighting. But she also never returned to Kentucky. She could not bear to see the mountains. Today, if you drive through Breathitt County, you will find no sign of Harrow Hollow. The road was finally repaired in 1992, but it leads only to an empty valley where nature has reclaimed what humans once built. The houses are gone. The schoolhouse is gone. The church is gone. The mine entrance has been sealed with concrete. There is nothing to indicate that anyone ever lived there, nothing except the mass graves on the hillside, which are marked with simple stones bearing no names, only dates. The locals know, the older ones at least. They know to avoid that valley. They know that the stories told by their grandparents are not legends or exaggerations, but simple truth. They know that somewhere beneath the surface, in a concrete-sealed chamber that will never be opened again, the evidence of what happened still exists. The jars are still there. The names are still there. The questions that Elias Croft spent 13 years answering are still recorded in journals that may never be read again. And if you ask those locals why the media never talks about Harrow Hollow, why the history books do not mention it, why the politicians who represent that district have never acknowledged it, they will give you the same answer. Some truths are too expensive to admit. Some failures are too complete to acknowledge. Some horrors are too human to confront. It is easier to pretend, easier to seal the records, easier to let the forest grow back over the graves and trust that time will eventually erase what conscience cannot accept. But the truth does not care about convenience. The truth does not stay buried just because we wish it would. And now you know what happened. You know why the 17-mile stretch of road through that valley is avoided after dark. You know why the survivors refused to speak for decades. You know why the testimony was sealed. And you know that somewhere in the archives of a county courthouse in eastern Kentucky, in a locked drawer that no one has opened in years, the full record still exists, waiting. If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly follows these stories. If this account moved you, disturbed you, or made you think about the abandoned places in our own society, click the like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now, because this is not the only story that has been hidden. There are others, and you deserve to know them all.